Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. In the church and among studies of the Bible, marriage is an often discussed topic, with what types of people one should marry, along with divorce and God's rules surrounding it. But here in chapter 7, Paul discusses something that is often not talked about when it comes to marriage, which is the responsibilities that each spouse has to fulfill the lawful physical needs of the other. So if you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 9. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. This chapter represents a transition in the book of 1 Corinthians. Up until this point, Paul has been dealing with sinful behavior in the church at Corinth. Whether it's divisiveness, the acceptance of immoral behavior, or taking brethren to civil court, the church at Corinth needed correction in order for them to be right with God. Having dealt with those things now, Paul turns to address the things that they had written to him about. It is interesting to know that Paul didn't just write this letter in response to what he had heard from the house of Chloe. He wrote this letter in part for that reason, but also in order to provide them more teaching on some areas. Some of those areas are going to be concerning idolatry, concerning the right of those who work preaching the gospel to earn a living doing so, concerning the Lord's Supper, concerning spiritual gifts, as well as the resurrection of Christ. Was it that Paul had never touched on these things before? No, for he's going to tell them in a couple places that he had told them some of these things before. But let's remember one thing. They didn't have the scriptures like we do today. That's why Paul is going to tell them later that they should desire the spiritual gift of prophecy over tongues, because prophecy would be more beneficial to them. We take for granted being able to pick up a Bible, turn to a book like 1 Corinthians, and learn God's will from it. They would have had the apostles' teaching, plus the teachings from any other inspired prophets that were around at that time, like Apollos. They would have to be on guard for false prophets that would teach things contrary to the apostles' teaching, similar to how we need to be aware of false teachers today. So just because Paul had taught them before didn't mean that they had all knowledge, nor did it mean that they might not have questions based on what Paul did teach. And so in chapter 7, the question is going to revolve around marriage, especially as it concerns marriage during times of persecution. It is important that we remember that this is the question under consideration, for unfortunately there are people who teach a ton of false doctrines from this chapter and use verses in this chapter out of context in order to do this. The first false doctrine taught concerns marriage itself, for Paul does say that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, with touch being a euphemism for having sex with her. Since Paul has already taught, and we'll teach in verse 2, that fornication and adultery are sinful, the sex Paul must be talking about is the sexual relationship that occurs within marriage. And so, since Paul is going to teach in verse 5 that married couples are to have sex, what Paul must be saying is that it is good for a man not to marry a woman, something that is confirmed in verse 8. If this was a blanket statement, then Paul would be at odds with God, for back in Genesis 2 verse 18, God said it was not good for man to be alone, so God made woman and joined man and woman in marriage. Once we realize that this is not a blanket statement, but rather a conditional statement that in the present distress, that will be discussed later on in the chapter, it was good for a man not to marry a woman, for as we will see, one has more concerns to consider when you have a spouse and the children that often come from that marriage as well. In times of persecution, if you die, you're not leaving your spouse a widow, your children without a parent. You're able to move a lot quicker and easier if the situation called for it. There are advantages to being single in this situation. However, if remaining single is going to lead someone to constantly be tempted to commit fornication, sexual relationships outside of the marriage bond, then this would not be good. So in that case, it would be better to marry to avoid sin. Staying single is not sinful, and neither is being married. But fornication is always sinful, and so we need to avoid the sin. And in order to do this, if fornication is going to be a temptation to us, then we need to get married. Getting married, though, comes with its responsibilities. For when we get married, we are no longer concerned with ourselves and our needs first. Rather, we need to be concerned with our spouse's needs above our own. And that includes their sexual needs. That's what Paul means when he says, let each man have his own wife and each woman have her own husband. Spouses own each other. I know in this day and age it's not in vogue to say that a husband owns his wife, but he does. But lest you think I'm a misogynist, I'm not. For just as a husband owns his wife, the wife owns her husband. It's not a master-slave relationship, but rather a helper relationship. A husband owns his wife in that she is his wife, not somebody else's, and that therefore he is to love and care for her, provide for her, and see that her needs are met. Those needs might be physical, such as food, clothing, and yes, sexual needs. But they also might be spiritual, for a husband should be helping his wife get to heaven. On the flip side, a wife owns her husband in that he is her husband and not somebody else's, and that she is to love and nurture him, submit to him as the head of the household, and see that his needs are met, whether they be physical needs or spiritual needs. Paul presents marriage as a partnership, which is exactly as God designed it from the beginning. Yes, husbands and wives have different roles in marriage, but they're on the same team. They're not in competition with each other, but in communion with each other and with God. The husband ought to be able to trust his wife implicitly, as should the wife be able to trust her husband implicitly. When it comes to the sexual relationship, that which is under consideration here, sex, or lack thereof, is not to be used by either spouse as a punishment-reward system. It is expected that husbands and wives be intimate with one another regularly, so as not to only meet the needs of their spouse, but in order not to place a stumbling block of temptation in front of their spouse to commit adultery. Paul says that each spouse in this does not have authority over their own body, but the other one does. This does not mean that one spouse can force the other into performing sexual acts that they're not comfortable with, nor abusing your spouse while having sex. What it does mean is that each spouse is charged with fulfilling the needs of the other in a loving way. The only exception to this instruction is that couples may consent to refrain from sexual relations for a time in order to give themselves over to fasting and prayer, spiritual matters. But that was only to be temporary, not permanent. Sex is one of the blessings that come from God for a marriage relationship, and so it should be one that is treasured by a couple and engaged in as a form of expressing one's love and affection for their mate. But let's not think that Paul is telling women that they must give their husbands sex all the time, lest they be sinning, or that Paul is telling the man that they must give their wives sex all of the time, lest they be sinning. There is not a set number of times per week, per month, or year that sexual relations must be had in order for a couple to be fulfilling Paul's instructions here. It will vary from couple to couple based on age, family situation, life situation, and even health situation. But it should be frequent enough in order to avoid temptation. Husbands, love and respect your wives, and do not force your wives to do that which she is not wanting to engage in at the moment. And the same thing goes for wives in respect for their husbands. For each spouse shouldn't be looking out for their own interests, but the interests of their spouse. And so in a healthy, loving relationship, sex should not be seen as a task, a burden, or even a punishment, but rather the opportunity to grow closer to your spouse through this expression of intimacy reserved solely for marriage. Verses 6 to 9 return us to the overall question, though, which is concerning marriage during times of persecution. And so Paul makes it clear that his directions about remaining unmarried during times of persecution, even for widows, is said by the way of concession rather than commandment. This means that Paul is giving the Corinthians advice, inspired advice, but he is not saying that it is ever sinful to marry. But if self-control can be had over sexual desires, then it would be better for the unmarried to remain as Paul was. This is one of the passages that confirms to us the marital state of Paul, which chapter 9 will say was a choice that Paul made. Other apostles made different choices, and both were okay. Some people, though, cannot be unmarried. Either they will face sexual temptations and so need to be married, or they just need to have a companion in order to live a full, satisfying life. These people should marry, and no commandment of the Lord says otherwise. But as we'll see later on down in the chapter, in times of persecution, they will face challenges that single people will not face in the same way. But if you ever hear someone use this chapter to teach that being single is better than being married, you can know that they're not teaching the truth, rather a perversion of Paul's words here. He is talking about times of persecution. Marriage is from God and is honorable in all, and let nobody tell you otherwise. We'll continue on with this chapter, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 to 16, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.